At Da Nang, summer of 1969, a twin-boom turboprop with 2 seats and 2 propellers flew more combat hours in a single month than the Republic F-105 Thunderchief, the most expensive single-seat strike fighter in the United States Air Force inventory. The OV-10 Bronco cost $600,000. The Thud cost $2.1 million. The Bronco burned roughly 80 gallons of fuel per hour. The Thud burned closer to 700. One airframe needed 4 maintenance man-hours per flight hour. The other needed 26. Look at those numbers and tell me which airplane the Air Force wanted to cancel. The Bronco. They tried 3 times before it ever reached a combat zone. Too slow. Too vulnerable for a war the Air Force wanted to fight with supersonic jets. A Marine requirement, not an Air Force priority. The Pentagon's own analysis called it unsurvivable in a moderate threat environment. Their word, unsurvivable. North American Rockwell built it anyway, because the Marines kept writing checks the Air Force kept trying to tear up. The airframe looked wrong. Twin booms off the wing, a stubby central nacelle with tandem seats under a greenhouse canopy, 2 Garrett T-76 turboprops pushing 676 shaft horsepower each, wingspan of 40 feet, maximum speed around 288 knots, which put it somewhere between a Cessna and an Apology in the minds of fighter pilots flying Mach 2. The whole machine weighed 6,800 pounds empty. An F-105's engine alone weighed more than that. But the Bronco did something the Thud could not do. It could loiter. It could orbit a grid square at 1,500 feet for 3 hours, watch the trail network below, mark targets with smoke rockets, call in the fast movers, then stay overhead to assess the damage. It carried 4 M60 machine guns and could haul external ordnance on 5 hardpoints, Zunis, smoke rockets, even napalm canisters, though its real weapon sat in the back seat. A trained observer with a map, a radio, and eyes that understood what the jungle hid. This story never gets told right. The Bronco's combat record in Vietnam, in Desert Storm, in counter-narcotics operations across Central America. It spans 3 decades and 4 branches of the armed services. Most aviation channels skip it entirely because there's no Mach 2 glamour and no missile kills to put in a highlight reel. If you want the version with the actual maintenance logs and sortie counts and nothing cut for time, hit subscribe. If you flew one or worked on one, leave a comment. Hit like so more people find this. The men who flew the OV-10 in Vietnam came from a particular slice of military aviation that doesn't get enough credit. Forward Air Controllers, FACs. They flew low enough to take small arms fire on nearly every mission. The after-action reports from VAL-4, the Navy's Light Attack Squadron, list ground fire hits in double digits per month. Lieutenant Commander Tom Grubaugh took 7.62 rounds through his wing spar on a mission over the Mekong Delta in 1970 and flew 40 minutes back to base because there simply weren't alternatives. Sources conflict on whether he reported the damage before or after landing. The survival rate should have been worse than it turned out. 33 OV-10s lost in combat in Vietnam across all services. That's not a small number for a fleet that never exceeded 157 airframes in country at peak strength. But the F-105 lost 334 aircraft in the same war. Proportionally, the Thud bled faster, and it operated at altitudes and speeds that should have kept it safer. The Bronco's designers at North American built redundancy into an airframe that weighed less than a pickup truck. Dual engines meant single-engine survivability. The twin-boom configuration meant a hit to one boom didn't necessarily lose the aircraft. The rear observer could take over flight controls if the front seater got hit. Every one of those features existed because the specification called for an airplane that would get shot at every single day and keep flying. It did. We do not need a new O-1 Bird Dog. That line appears in a 1963 Air Force memorandum responding to the Marine Corps' LARA requirement. Light Armed Reconnaissance Aircraft. The memo runs 4 pages. 3 of them explain why the money should go to the F-111 instead. At Quantico, the Marines saw a different war coming. Not the nuclear exchange the Air Force spent its budget preparing for. Smaller conflicts, jungle, rice paddies. places where a Mach 2 fighter bomber arrived too fast to see anything, dropped ordnance on a set of coordinates, and left without knowing whether it hit troops or water buffalo. The Marines wanted an airplane that could find the enemy first and kill him second. The Air Force considered this an insult to progress. The LARA specification landed on desks at 11 aircraft companies in 1964. It asked for something absurd: a machine that could operate from unprepared strips of 600 feet, carry a useful weapons load, loiter for 3 hours, fly slowly enough for visual reconnaissance, survive hits from small arms, and cost less than $1 million per copy. North American Aviation won the contract in August of that year with a design its own engineers privately called the Flying Pickup Truck. The nickname stuck because it fit. The fuselage pod between those twin booms contained a cargo bay large enough to carry 3,200 pounds of supplies or 5 combat-equipped Marines. No fighter in the inventory could do that. No transport could shoot back. The first prototype flew in July of 1965 out of Columbus, Ohio. The sound it made at full power, both T-76 engines turning at 41,000 RPM, sat at a particular frequency that witnesses described as a sustained metallic scream, not the throaty roar of a radial or the whine of a jet, but something between a table saw and a turbine generator. You heard it in your teeth before you heard it in your ears. The North American design team included engineers who'd worked on the T-28 Trojan trainer. One of them, a structures man named Ed Aiken, held a patent on a wing spar joint used in agricultural dusters. The Bronco's wing spar borrowed from that patent, a crop duster's structural philosophy in a combat aircraft. This connects to nothing about the airplane's combat record, but it tells you something about the engineering culture that built it. Back to the timeline. By 1966, the Air Force had committed $4.2 billion to the F-111 program. The entire OV-10 procurement, 357 airframes across all variants, ran to roughly $215 million. The F-111's unit cost exceeded $6.1 million. For the price of 15 F-111s, the Pentagon bought the entire Bronco fleet. The Air Force's own Tactical Analysis Division acknowledged in a 1967 report that forward air control missions suffered from an absence of purpose-built platforms. The report recommended expanded procurement of the OV-10. Air Force headquarters buried it. The airplane has no mission in modern warfare. Brigadier General Arthur Gruber told a Senate Appropriations Subcommittee in March of 1967. 11 months later, VMO-2 deployed the first OV-10s to Da Nang. The Marines sent them because they needed them. The Air Force followed 6 months after that, quietly, without a press release, flying the airplane a general had just told Congress served no purpose. The Bronco landed in Vietnam and proved every one of them wrong. The smell hit you first. Avgas and red laterite dust and the wet green rot of the tree line, 50 yards past the runway threshold. At Quang Tri, the strip ran 2,200 feet of pierced steel planking laid over packed earth. An F-4 Phantom needed 6,800 feet minimum. An F-105 needed more. The Bronco rolled out in under 800, turned around, and launched again in 6 minutes. 6 minutes from shutdown, to wheels up with a fresh load of Zuni rockets under the sponsons. The Pentagon systems analysts never modeled what that turnaround time did to close air support. A flight of 2 F-4s departing Da Nang carried enough fuel for roughly 40 minutes on station at a target 80 nautical miles inland. Transit consumed the rest. Total ordnance delivered per sortie: 8 Mark 82 500-pound bombs, plus whatever the backseater could do with the SUU-23 gun pod. Cost per sortie in $1969 ran to approximately $24,000, factoring fuel, ordnance expenditure, and prorated maintenance. A single OV-10 sortie from a forward strip cost $3,100. The Bronco stayed on station for 3 hours. It marked targets for those F-4s with white phosphorus rockets that cost $11 each. Without those marks, the fast movers dropped blind on coordinates radioed from a map. Hit rates on unmarked targets ran below 14%, according to a RAND study published in 1971. With a FAC overhead placing smoke, the rate climbed above 51%. The entire close air support system depended on the slowest airplane in it. Captain Larry Fritz, 20th Tactical Air Support Squadron, flew 212 OV-10 missions between April 1969 and March 1970. On his 147th mission, north of Kontum, he put in 4 flights of fighters on a battalion-sized NVA force moving through open terrain at dusk, 14 minutes of coordination, 11 radio frequency changes. He held the Bronco in a left orbit at 1,200 feet, while tracers from a 12.7 millimeter position floated past the canopy, green, lazy, curving, the way they always looked until they weren't lazy anymore. One round punched through the belly pan and lodged in the cargo compartment floor. Fritz stayed on station until the last F-100 dropped its last canister of nape and the tree line stopped moving. "I had fuel for 40 more minutes," he told his debrief officer. "Wasn't going to leave early over one hole." The after-action report credits that single mission with 137 enemy KIA. The Bronco carried no bombs that day. Fritz killed no one. He just refused to leave. 72 OV-10 crews flew the Prairie Fire mission. 18 didn't come back. Those numbers come from MACVSOG's operational summary for 1969 through 1971, declassified in 2005. Prairie Fire meant something specific. Covert reconnaissance teams inserted into Laos along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, 6 to 12 men on the ground in denied territory, and 1 OV-10 overhead as their only link to extraction, fire support, and survival. The FAC didn't just mark targets on Prairie Fire. He ran the entire battle from a cockpit, moving at 160 knots through karst valleys, narrow enough to touch the walls. At Nakhon Phanom, the Air Force's 23rd Tactical Air Support Squadron kept a duty roster for trail missions that read like a countdown. 2 flights per day, dawn and dusk, each crew pulling 5 consecutive days before rotating off. The trail network below ran through triple canopy jungle so dense that ground teams disappeared from sight within seconds of insertion. The Bronco pilot found them by radio, by prearranged smoke signals, by memorizing the exact bend in the exact stream where the team leader said he'd be. Then he orbited at 800 feet, below the ridgeline, inside the range of everything the NVA positioned along the trail, and waited for contact. Contact always came. The NVA's 559th Transportation Group defended the trail with an integrated air defense network that a 1970 DIA assessment described as disproportionate to the value of the logistical targets, 12.7 millimeter positions every few hundred meters. 37 millimeter guns at choke points. By 1971, SA-2 batteries had moved into the Laotian Panhandle. The Bronco flew through all of it at altitudes where a rifleman with an SKS could put a round through the canopy glass. Captain Edward Leonard, 23rd TASS, took off from NKP on the morning of March 14, 1971, to cover a SOG team in contact 14 kilometers inside Laos. The team had triggered an NVA company. Leonard arrived overhead and began stacking fighters. 2 flights of F-4s, a flight of A-1 Sky Raiders, and a Spectre gunship holding at 12,000 feet. He had fuel for 2 hours and 10 minutes. The team needed all of it. For 90 minutes, Leonard flew a racetrack pattern tight enough that his wingtip clearance from the ridge on each turn measured less than 100 feet. His backseater, First Lieutenant James Gruber, no relation to the general who told Congress the airplane had no mission, called corrections to the fighters, while Leonard fired marking rockets into positions so close to the friendlies that the SOG team leader later said he felt the heat from the white phosphorus on his neck. The radio transcript from that morning fills 11 pages. The file lists 14 separate fighter passes coordinated in sequence without a single short round. At the 1 hour 40-minute mark, Leonard took 37 millimeter fire through the right engine nacelle. The engine seized. He feathered the prop, held the orbit on one engine at 120 knots, 30 knots above stall with the asymmetric drag, and stayed for another 22 minutes until the extraction helicopters pulled the team out. All 6 men survived. Leonard flew the Bronco 87 nautical miles back to NKP on one engine. The maintenance log notes 47 holes in the airframe. The right boom had a through-and-through from a 14.5mm round that missed the rudder cable by less than an inch. The records don't say whether that distance was measured or estimated. Aircraft recovered to parking. Right engine removed. Aircraft returned to service 48 hours later. That's the maintenance entry. The entire entry. Nothing about Leonard, Gruber, or 6 men alive in Laos, because a turboprop that a general called purposeless absorbed 47 holes and kept flying. The Bronco absorbed all of it. The men who flew it absorbed more. How many times does the Air Force have to relearn the same war? In August 1990, OV-10s from VM-01 and VM-02 deployed to the Persian Gulf. The Marines pulled them out of what amounted to semi-retirement. Training squadrons, reserve units, airframes with 15,000 hours on them. They flew combat missions over Kuwait starting January 29, 1991. 2 were shot down within 72 hours, both by SA-16 shoulder-fired missiles. Both crews survived. The airframe that had absorbed rifle fire and 37mm shells over Laos could not survive a 1980s infrared seeker. The threat had changed. The Bronco hadn't. The Marine Corps retired the OV-10 on July 31, 1994. The Air Force had already let it go in 1961. Sources conflict on the exact decommission date for the last Air Force airframe. The records list 2 different months. The ceremony, if there was one, generated no press coverage the National Archives can locate. Afghanistan came first. Iraq followed. Counterinsurgency in terrain that looked nothing like the Fulda Gap the Air Force had spent 40 years preparing to defend. Ground commanders in Fallujah and Kunar province requested low-slow aircraft for persistent overwatch. The Air Force offered B-1 bombers orbiting at 30,000 feet, dropping GPS-guided munitions on coordinates relayed through 3 separate digital links. Cost per flight hour on the B-1 ran to roughly $58,000 in 2006. The OV-10's last reported cost per flight hour, $1,200 in 1992 money. In 2015, Naval Air Systems Command pulled 2 OV-10s out of storage at Davis-Monthan and sent them to Iraq under a program called Combat Dragon 2. They flew over Islamic State positions for 90 days. The after-action summary uses the phrase operationally effective 4 times in 11 pages. The file recommends further evaluation. No further evaluation occurred. 20 years after the Bronco's retirement, the Air Force launched the Light Attack Experiment, a program to find a cheap turboprop for counterinsurgency. The Embraer A-29 Super Tucano and the Textron A-T6 competed. Testing ran from 2017 through 2019. The Air Force selected neither for its own inventory. The program closed without procurement. At Moody Air Force Base, an A-29 sits in a maintenance hangar undergoing evaluation for a foreign military sales contract. The crew chief has a checklist to finish before lunch.